Okay, various things have happened. One is an amazing phenomenon occurred. The Giants actually won. In honor of this occasion, I have decided to wear clothes I wore 54 years ago when the Giants last won. That's when they were still in New York. It's not quite 54 years, but I had this jacket tailor-made in Oxford long before any of you were born. And I don't remember the exact year, but it certainly would have been, well, yeah. It has to be at least 45 years ago, 65 maybe. But it was made by a very good tailor. I was a bit skinnier then than I am now. And the marvelous thing about really good tailor-made clothing is, roughly speaking, it lasts forever. So in honor of the occasion, I put on, I wanted to illustrate various other things for a course in ontology of society. Men's fashions don't change very much. Very few people have approached me today to say, you are wearing clothes from several centuries back, or at least a century back, what I am, in fact. And just to add to the ensemble, as we say in Paris, I'm wearing a college tie of a kind that has not changed forever. And I'm even wearing a white shirt, some of you don't see so much of as you used to in the old days. Anyway, I wanted to illustrate a point. Men's fashions don't really change very much. This little frame where you have the necktie and the shirt collar and the jacket, that seems to be a feature that's now gone on, well, for more than a century. There are small variations on it. But essentially, we're very much conformist in dress. We like to think in Berkeley that we're nonconformist, but in fact, we're pretty conformist. Some kids showed up at class with no clothes on, and this created consternation. And as I think I may have mentioned before, if I'm a woman lecturer in Berkeley and I want to show up in blue jeans, that's perfectly okay. But if I am a male lecturer and I want to show up in a miniskirt and net stockings and high heels, even in Berkeley, I think that would raise an eyebrow or two. Now, when I first moved to this area, I was surprised to see at the opera, you occasionally saw members of a certain community who would show up dressed in miniskirt and high heels. And to the credit, male members, to the credit of San Francisco, no one paid the slightest bit of attention. There's some guy there dressed, well, like a female prostitute. No one paid the slightest bit of attention. Anyway, we are very conformist in clothing, as you will. If you really did wear some eccentric clothing, there would be social sanctions imposed. Okay. The other thing is that today is an election day, and I am inclined to two kinds of reflection. One is there's always some argument to the effect that it's irrational to vote, and I think that shows you have a very bad theory of rationality. The assumption is that the only reason for voting is to change the result of the election. If you don't change the result of the election by voting, then your vote was, as they say, wasted. That's a mistaken conception of collective intention. I'm going to take the jacket off, having performed the speech act of wearing it because it's kind of hot in here. But I've actually written something about that, and I think I'll put it on B-Space, why it is in fact rational to vote, and contrary to the economic theory of rationality, which is going to be our main topic of discussion today. Another point I want to make is that though in democratic society there's always a great deal of screaming and howling about the importance of the election, and in general I think the elections are important, all the same, in a successful democratic society, important issues cannot be decided by elections. If the important issues are not decided by elections, when they are, you have a real crisis. Matters of life and death, who's going to be rich, who's going to be poor, where you're going to live, what kind of career you're going to have, and whether you're going to live or die, those are not decided by elections. If they were, you can't have a stable society. If you knew that if your team lost in the election, you and your friends were going to go to concentration camps, you couldn't plan your life on a reasonable set of expectations. because elections are too unpredictable. They're too unstable. So there are various ways that societies deal with this. One is there are some issues that are too hot to handle, and they are not discussed in elections. Politicians won't touch them. And consequently, they have to be decided by the Supreme Court, which Americans regard as kind of a deus ex machina. It comes down from the Supreme Court as if from God, and people will accept it, however irrational it might be. The selection of George Bush as the winner of the election in the year 2000, the decision on abortion rights, all of these, and racial equality, all of these seem to me to be matters that in the end the Supreme Court has to settle. When there's an issue that can't be settled by the Supreme Court, you get all kinds of problems, and the worst problem was, of course, the Civil War, a catastrophe that is hard for us to imagine to this day because the sheer number of people who died were not only vastly greater in relative terms than our other wars, but vastly greater in absolute terms. With a much smaller population, we had a higher casualty rate. While I'm on the subject, let me call your attention to certain facts that you will not get by reading the newspapers about current conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. One is we're constantly told about how terrible it is that these huge numbers of Americans are dying. And of course, it's always a tragedy when anybody dies. But in fact, the casualty rates are trivial. They're trivially small. Remember, 1,000 Americans a day die from cigarette smoking. And that's an underestimate. It's closer to 500,000 a year, but minimum 1,000 people a day die from cigarette smoking. Now, we're having a war on terrorism. How many thousands a day do the terrorists kill? I mean, there were 3,000 killed in September 11th in New York, but essentially the casualty rates in the war on terrorism are minuscule compared to real wars. We lost 250,000 men in the Second World War. We lost 90,000 in Korea. These are round figures, and 50,000 in Vietnam. And the casualty rates in the war on terrorism are very small in comparison. A second thing to remember, and this, I don't know why no politician has the nerve to say this, is if you're going to have a war on terrorism, which, by the way, is incidentally a category mistake. Terrorism names a method. It's like having a war on transportation. It doesn't make any sense to have a war on terrorism. What we're not having is a war on transportation. We're having a war on a certain class of truck drivers, a certain class of fanatical Muslims who want to kill us, and that's called a war on terrorism. But other kinds of terrorism, Irish terrorism, Basque terrorism, we don't care about it. So the war on terrorism is a misnomer. But anyway, aside from that, there are two things to remember. In a war on terrorism, most of the casualties are going to be civilians. It's not like regular warfare where you can get the civilians to move out of the way. By definition here, the civilians are in the way because the people you're fighting against are intermingled with the civilian population, and deliberately so. So whenever you hear that these innocent civilians died, well, of course, most of the I'm not saying it's okay, that we ought not to try to prevent it, but it's a mistake that there's some aberration involved in civilian deaths. That's the first thing to remember. The second thing to remember is that on our side, most of our casualties will be caused by us. They'll be caused by friendly fire. And we always think this is a terrible tragedy. We killed that poor football player. Well, most of the guys who died on our side, we killed. Why? Because we got much more weaponry, and we're firing it off in all directions. And similarly with the Second World War, if you died in an air attack fighting on the Western Front, the chances are you were killed by American or British bombers, as they often just miss. So these are terrible tragedies whenever we kill our own people or whenever civilians die. But they're in the very nature of the operation we're engaged in. Now, a couple other things. Don't take it too seriously when there are these terrible terrorist attacks. It's true they're unnerving to the local population, but they make no difference to the strategic situation. If you want to understand the strategic situation in, let's say, Iraq, the questions to ask are, what are real estate values in Baghdad? Now, they've been going up steadily, especially after Bush was elected for the second time around. They went up 25% the next day after that election. So that's the first thing. Look at stable real estate values and look at things like school attendance. Now look also at female attendance in schools, and you will find out the degree of success or failure. You won't actually be able to tell much by this or that terrorist attack, because terrorism, suicide bombings, for example, are a very cost-effective way for our enemies to make a lot of noise at very little cost to themselves. They kill more people than the suicide bombers, than are lost among the suicide bombers, and they get you a lot of attention and publicity, but they have very little long-term strategic significance. The significance they have isn't on who you kill. If you kill a local police chief who's been police chief for the past 20 years, he's hard to replace. But if you kill people at random, that's not of a great deal of, again, it's a terrible tragedy, but it's not of much strategic importance. It's a very little strategic influence. Okay, anyway, I just want to fill you in on these points because they're not things you're going to read in newspapers. No, what I've said, I think, are obvious common sense points, but you will not, no politician will say them. They all know them, but they won't say them, and they're not the kind of thing that you will read even in intelligent newspapers. Okay, now I'm going to resume our discussion of last time, which was kind of fun, about rationality. And in particular, I'm going to talk about Gary Becker's article, what's it called, The Economic Approach to Human Behavior. And I reread it conscientiously just before class. And I was actually astounded. It has some things in it that I had forgotten. It turns out suicides are not only rational, they're always rational. And indeed, almost, he wants to say all deaths, but he can't bring himself to say that. Almost all deaths are suicides. Why? Well, because of the three axioms that he is exploring, which I've written on the blackboard, that in human behavior we have stable preferences. What we try to do is maximize the achievement of our preferences. We try to get on a higher preference curve. That's just another way. This is another way of saying desires. And this is desire satisfaction. We're maximizing that. And the third point is a familiar point from economics, namely that you always tend toward market equilibrium. So if the price of a good rises, demand will decline. And if demand increases, prices will rise, and you get the point where you get an equilibrium where, from the point of view of the consumer and the point of view of the producer and seller, the entrepreneur, you cannot increase your profit or your desire satisfaction by altering. At this point, it's where the entrepreneur will sell where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. He cannot increase his amount of profit by either decreasing or increasing the amount of goods that he's supplying. And that's because at that point, the amount of his goods that the consumers will buy is precisely at the point where his marginal cost equals his marginal revenue, but where the supply and the demand curve intersect. Okay, that's the model for rational behavior. Now, I used to think, before I reread this thing, that he was talking about the economic conception of rationality. But a careful reading tells me he doesn't think this is a model of rationality. He thinks this is how things are in fact, that this is in fact the way people behave, not the way that ideally rational people would behave, but it is in fact the way that human beings do behave. All human behavior can be viewed as involving participants who maximize their utility from a stable set of preferences and accumulate an optimal amount of information and other inputs in a variety of markets. That's supposed to be something that just plain happens. It doesn't set an ideal of rationality. He thinks he's describing how human beings behave. Now, to his credit, he sees there are some odd consequences, and he embraces those. However, let me stop for questions, because I said a whole lot of stuff about the permanence of fashion, the tragedy of deaths in Afghanistan and Iraq and other things. If anybody wants to comment on them or ask questions, now is a good time to do it. I'm annoyed by each day the newspapers talk as if it's the most amazing thing. Civilians were killed in an air raid. Well, what did they expect? And of course, as I say, it's a terrible tragedy, but it's a mistake to think that somehow or other it's a terrible anomaly. Who would ever thought such a thing could occur? In a war on terrorism, most of the people who die are going to be innocent civilians. That's the nature of the operation. Any questions about all of that stuff? Because I'm now going to launch into a discussion of Gary Becker, for what it's worth. I thought we had fun. I mean, it was fun the other day when we were talking about rationality, so I thought we might actually take a target, somebody who has a conception of rationality radically different from my own, and I'm going to tell you how it's different in a minute. Any questions or comments? Okay, let's go with Gary Becker. Gary Becker says there are these three features of stable preferences. People come to a decision-making situation with a fixed set of desires, and sometimes they might vary a little bit, but by and large they're stable, and that has to mean stable not only in any given situation, but stable over time. Secondly, their behavior will be to maximize their preferences, that is to get the highest amount of desire satisfaction given their resources. And then in cases where people are dealing with other people, there will be a kind of market equilibrium where the people who would be better off getting married will get married, and the people who will not be better off, who given the supply of available partners will be better off not being married, will not be married. That's what the market naturally will tend to. Now notice in this discussion, all decisions are treated essentially the same. Deciding whether to bring your umbrella to the campus and deciding whether to commit suicide are exactly the same kind of decision made on exactly the same consideration. You read the article. I'm not kidding. He actually does say all of these things. Now, he's got some problems. It turns out that suicides are always the rational thing to do because they are cases where you have a stable preference. You prefer death to whatever it is you're committing suicide over, being disappointed in love or what have you. And then, again, to his credit, he says, now, I'm not going to cheat by supposing that there's some other factors here that are not understood, some other costs or some other benefits. See if I can find that passage. It's a real gem. He's talking about the economic approach to behavior, postulates the existence of costs, monetary or psychic, of taking advantage of these opportunities that eliminate their profitability, costs that may not be easily seen by outside observers. Of course, postulating the existence of costs closes or completes the economic approach in the same almost tautological way that postulating the existence of sometimes unobserved uses of energy completes the energy system and preserves the law of the conservation of energy. And then he goes on how systems of analysis in chemistry, genetics, and other fields are completed in a similar manner. In other words, apparent cases where the agent behaves irrationally are not to be explained by saying, well, there's some extra cost. No, he thinks that's cheating. We just say tautologically that by definition, all of these have to maintain, and we're going to, he says it's almost tautology. I think it has to be a complete tautology in the same way that in economic theory, savings equals investment is a tautology because you define those in such a way that they're always going to come out as equivalent. Okay, now, but the striking thing about it is this is not supposed to be a set of norms that we might aspire to or fail to aspire to. It's as if he were describing physics. It's as if he's talking about the flow of water down a mountainside. That just this behavior is going to happen. People have these preferences. They maximize their behavior, and there is a market equilibrium. What he would say about really crazy behavior, I don't know. I mean, the 8-year-old girl who's trying to tear her eyeball out. There are such cases, and we have ways of treating them. We think they are something wrong, and they have to be restrained. Now, on his account, that's just a case of maximizing preferences. She prefers her eyeball torn out to her eyeball being in the head, and that's a preference like any other. I don't see how he's got an answer. There must be an answer to that. Yeah.
It sounds to me like you're just evaluating good or bad quality, or like the quality of the decision in a different place. Because you're saying the problem is that it's irrational. I might say that the problem is she wants to tear her eye out.
No, you see, I want to say the desire to tear your eye out is an irrational desire. And I don't think he can say that. Because all you have is stable, all you have is stable preference. And one, as he says, one preference is as good as another. Preferring to carry your umbrella or preferring to commit suicide. He says most deaths are suicides. Why? Because, of course, you could have prolonged your life by moving from wherever it is that you live to some place where life expectancy is longer. Where is life expectancy longer than Berkeley? Maybe in the middle of the most boring parts of Denmark, where there's nothing to do but drink milk. And they do live a long time. I give them that. And so the fact that I don't move there, slow suicide, says Becker. Anyway, let's come back to you. Yes, you had your hand up at the back. Yeah, I think you cannot make sense out of human behavior if you don't invoke such things, notions as irrationality and insanity. Now, there was a period when this was regarded as a form of oppression. And there was a guy named Thomas Jaz, spelled like this. I think that's how it is. Is there another S in there? Is it like that? Okay. There are two S's in there. It must be Hungarian. It's got a Hungarian smell to it. Apologies to Hungarians in the audience. There's no, but it just looks Hungarian to me. And I never knew this guy, but he published a book to the effect that really all forms of incarceration of the so-called insane are a form of oppression. So some people have different kinds of behavior from the rest of us. You shouldn't lock them up for that reason. And I think in some cases you should. The 8-year-old girl who's trying to tear her eyeball out, she needs to be restrained. But Jaj had a problem with that. And then Foucault, whom I admire in many ways, wrote a very important book called Histoire de la Folie. And it was called Madness. What was the translation called? Madness and Civilization. What was it? Do you remember the name of it? But Histoire de la Folie. And what he said was that societies define what is permissible behavior by setting a boundary, and on the other side of the boundary, you're said to be crazy. But it's completely arbitrary what behavior we count as crazy. So there's a form of oppression. Now, Foucault is less, I almost want to say less crazy, but that's begging the question. Foucault is less extreme than Jaj. Jaj thinks that the treatment of insanity is a form of oppression. Foucault just remarks that there are these boundaries that communities set, and a community defines itself by what it regards as the boundary of the permissible, and the boundary of the permissible marks what we see as insanity. Okay, so I have real problems with Becker. Now, let's suppose Becker were here. He might have answers to what I've said. He might say, well, of course, in some cases you have to restrain people. The 8-year-old, we can't assume that she's part of this same structure of behavior. But he doesn't, in fact, say that. This is treated, he treats human behavior as if it were a natural science, and these are the laws of force in this natural science. Preferences, maximizing behavior, and market equilibria when you get different people in a market. Yes?
So actually this is going back to what you were saying before.
Yeah.
You would say that the 8-year-old wants to tear their eyes is rational. And the justification for that is probably something like it's very harmful to her.
That's right. She's going to have trouble reading books later on.
Okay, so where's the problem that how do you draw a line?
Yes.
Irrational behavior that seems obviously irrational because it's
Yeah.
harmful and
Right.
harmful consequences.
Exactly. Such as drinking beer when you're underage. What a terrible thought. I remember when I was a 16-year-old in Milwaukee. In those days, in Milwaukee, every street corner, difference between Milwaukee and other cities had drugstores on the corners. Milwaukee had taverns. And I finally decided to boycott a tavern when I was 16 because they asked me for my identification. I thought that was outrageous. Nobody had ever done that before. But in any case, there is a problem about what is regarded as permissible behavior, and I'm not going to answer that because it's yet. I'm going to answer it later. The question has to do with human rights. What are human rights, and what are the justification for human rights? And there are a few subjects on which more nonsense is talked than the subject of human rights. And I want you to read the chapter. It's in the latest book. It's in Making the Social World about human rights, and we'll talk about that. However, the problem is not the marginal cases. In the state of California, we have set a law that you can't drink alcohol until you're 21. Now, in some ways, that's absurd. I used to work for a winery. Suppose a kid is being raised to take over the winery, and at the age of 20 and a half, he attends wine tastings to learn how to taste this stuff. You're going to arrest us all? I mean, that would seem silly. But this is the problem with all legislation, is that you have to draw a line somewhere, and the line is always arbitrary. The question is not, is the line arbitrary? Of course it is. The question is, do you have a principle behind the legislation? And I think the principle that you want to restrict alcohol consumption so that small children don't go around drunk all the time, that's a pretty good principle. Now, what's the cutoff point? I think 21 is probably a bit much, but this is, we can discuss that. The principle is what matters. Okay, other questions? Do you want to say some more? Yeah. Oh, no. Vanessa.
Okay, so I wanted to ask about what you said about postulating of costs. So
Yeah.
I took it that whereas on your account it seems arbitrary where we draw the line or how you get to be the
Yeah.
one who decides what's irrational. The problem on this account is that you just postulate costs so that you assume you take the
Yeah.
action as the starting point and
Yeah.
back yourself out so that it comes out rational.
Yeah.
How? By postulating costs. And so
Yeah.
on that account everything comes out automatically and ends up being
The,
rational.
the interesting thing,
What are you saying?
that's right. That's what he's saying. But it isn't just everything comes out rational. Everything comes out exemplifying these principles. And I'd like to go through it again. I read it just before class, and it struck me there's actually very little discussion of rationality. What he says is, I'm not going to cheat by supposing, well, there's some crazy behavior that's irrational. No, all behavior is like this. All human behavior is just like that. And I'm going to treat this, he doesn't present this as a theory of rationality. I am going to treat it as if it were and see what comes out, because I've always assumed it was that way, but it's not. It's a theory, it's a sort of Newtonian physics of human behavior. It's psychophysics, and we're supposed to think these are natural forces, and then you got laws that follow, and he states two of the laws. Yeah, say some more.
So doesn't the postulating of costs seem to be the cheat?
Doesn't seem to be what?
Doesn't that seem to be the cheat?
Well, that's one of the cheats. I'll mention some others. Yes.
Maybe irrationality on his account is when you always choose to marginalize your utility.
When you choose less utilities. But you see, what he has to say is, if you choose less utility, that proves that it had more utility. And this was part of a doctrine in economics called revealed preferences. If you want to know what stable preferences are, look at how they are revealed in human behavior. Now, Amartya Sen, who shares with me doubts about this, that's Amartya Sen, said, on this account, Buridan's ass reveals a preference for starvation. Does everybody remember the story of Buridan's ass? Buridan's ass is faced with two bales of hay. One is over there and one is over there. But there's nothing to choose between them. They're exactly equal in desirability. So he stands there looking from one to the other until he starves to death because there's nothing to choose between the two. Now, says Sen, well, on this account of rational behavior, he would be revealing a preference for starvation. And that he thinks that's kind of a reductio ad absurdum. Yes?
It sounds to me like if he's admitting it's tautological,
Yeah.
I don't see how it's a cheat.
Yeah. Yeah.
right? And he admits that its applicability is limited.
Yeah.
Or, I mean, and
No, but limited. No, he thinks this is general theory that accounts for all human behavior. It's not modest.
true.
Yeah.
But in any particular case, the question is, can you observe these utilities? But my question was something
Yeah.
else. And understanding that at first it sounds ridiculous, in what sense is this girl's desire to tear her eye out irrational?
Yeah, okay. And that's a serious question. I mean, it's not an exam question. You know the answer, and you want to know if I know the answer, because I think we all know the answer. It's really not good for her.
Okay.
I mean, and I could tell you in great detail how much fun I have having eyes, and what life would. I mean, I really, of all the people I feel sorry for, the totally blind are among the worst, because I'm an Augenmensch. I mean, I can't imagine life without the joys of vision. I left my reading glass at home today, so I can't read much. I had to kind of do that bit that folks do. But I think once you've looked closely at the paintings of Van Gogh, the world never looks the same. And there's that marvelous museum now in Amsterdam, and apparently they got some of those pictures over in San Francisco right now, as we speak. What are we doing here? But anyway, if we go to the De Young, and no damn sky ever looks the same after you've seen the Starry Night in Van Gogh. So I think vision, it's hard to imagine the amount of fun you would have with vision if you didn't have vision, and it would be a horrible tragedy to be without it. So I can tell you in horrible detail what the girl loses if she tears her eyeballs out. Yes? She has unstable preferences. This is false. And I'm now going to list several false assumptions that Becker makes. One, he neglects time. And rational decision-making operates over time, and it is a matter of organizing our I think that's what we would say, is that even if we thought there might be such a thing as a rational decision to cut your eyeball out, she's not in a position to make it. But he's got a general law about human behavior. And is it working? Can you hear? Maybe I have to get it closer. Okay, I'll get it. Is it all right? Here we are, breaking our chalk, misusing our mic. Okay, it's sort of all right. I can wave it around as I talk. But he doesn't do that. This is kind of the laws of human behavior, which are like the laws of physics, and they ought to apply to all human behavior. But I want to say they don't apply to the little girl who's trying to tear her eyeball out. She does not have stable preferences, and there's no rational decision to maximize her behavior, and there's no question of market equilibrium. So I'm now going to list some things I think are wrong with his model. Yes?
Just going back to what you said, but you say that the little girl is irrational and that Becker can't say that she's she has a preference to have a life or something better articulated, and a preference to tear out her eyes, but those two preferences are inconsistent, and therefore she's
Yeah.
because of the inconsistency of preference.
But she has no preference to have a better life. In the case we're imagining, if you ask her what she wants, I want to tear my eyeballs out. Yes, but what books will you be able to read when you're 20 years old? It's a meaningless question.
Yes, she might not answer, I want to have a good life and after what she wants, but that doesn't mean she doesn't want to have a good life.
Well, we postulate that, but Becker tells us that kind of postulation would be cheating. We would be postulating that she's irrational, and you can't do that. Yes?
It really doesn't sound like his project is aimed at judging people's preferences. He's trying to explain them, and if
Yeah.
a girl were to tear her eye out, I think we've already given everything we need.
Yeah. But the problem is, this is called the economic approach to human behavior. and it is not a modest article. What he says is, this isn't just a way of thinking about things. It is a universal set of principles that describe and explain all human behavior. And he has nothing to say about apparent cases of irrationality except that, well, they're not really irrational. Suicide is perfectly irrational. Indeed, all deaths, or almost all deaths, he says, are really a form of suicide, because you could have done something to prolong your life, like whatever it is that you do. You watch television instead of doing push-ups or whatever it is, and that is shortening your life. At the back, you had your hand up. Yeah.
I'm not sure if Becker ever says that, ever talks about excluding children from the insane, but I know that Milton Friedman definitely took an economic approach to youth behavior. He said that we do exclude them because what we're trying to do is generate predictions about human behavior.
Yeah.
Not necessarily explain how preferences are formed or
Yeah.
why people act. But that's why you can call
Yeah.
economics a positive science, because
Makes predictions.
assumptions,
Yeah.
even if they don't accurately reflect reality, they still generate accurate predictions.
Yeah, well, but the problem is, lately, they haven't been doing very well. And I really think one of you ought to get busy and do what John Maynard Keynes did in the 1930s. I mean, I must have mentioned this to you before. The prevailing conventional wisdom in my education in economics when I was an undergraduate was that monetarism had been decisively refuted, if not, by nothing else, had been refuted by the Great Depression, and that fiscal policy had now been established as the only rational way to manage the economy, that Keynes was ascendant. And then, some decades ago, this view was refuted, especially by Milton Friedman, but other authors were involved. But Milton Friedman got the Nobel Prize, I think, for his refutation of this orthodoxy. Now, the orthodoxy that replaced it became the mantra, the free market mantra of the business schools in the United States. When my younger son went to the Harvard Business School, that was the slogan to explain everything. The free market, that was the ideal. And then it all came crashing down in 2008, and we have no intelligent analysis of why it became crashing down, or at least if there is an analysis, I don't know it. And we have no alternative theory. Nobody has come forward with a successor to Keynes. Now, what is happening today is an exact repetition of what happened in the 30s. The Democrats are saying we have to have Keynesian economic policies, and the Republicans don't know what they're saying, but they're saying, well, we don't want that. That means big government and lots of deficits and all that sort of thing. But I can't detect an alternative set of proposals. Yes, you, and then I'm going to lecture for a while. Yeah.
In the light of what you just said,
Yeah.
how much do you think the shortcomings of Becker's arguments are sincere mistakes?
Yeah.
How could you not be aware of these shortcomings? To me, it seems like this is a justificatory theory. By no means is he such a fool that he claims these things as true.
Yeah, no, he's not such a fool, and he does claim they're true. Well, they're true. I want to tell you something about intellectual life. Don't suppose that apparently preposterous claims are either signs of stupidity or dishonesty. There are other alternatives. When I first read The Computational Theory of the Mind, the brain's really a digital computer and the mind's a computer program, I thought maybe it's a joke. These people don't know one end of a neuron from another. But no, they were quite serious and quite intelligent and horrendously wrong. Now, when I pointed that out, they did not applaud with enthusiasm. On the contrary. My best experience was at Columbia. I got up and gave my lecture attacking strong artificial intelligence, and the chairman of the computer science department came to me afterwards and said, this was terrific. I'm going to lunch with members of my department, and I'm going to present your ideas to them and see what they say. I saw him after lunch, and I said, well, what did they say? He said, they all said the same thing. How will it affect funding? In other words, if we accept Searle's Chinese room argument, what happens to our research grants? Well, they were maximizing their stable preferences for more money. Okay, I'm going to lecture for a while, and then we'll have, you'll have plenty of time to attack me. I want to say some things that are wrong with this. One is, it neglects time, and two, preferences are not stable, or rather I would say desires change. And indeed, much of human rationality is trying to figure out what you most desire. The picture of rationality as starting with an inventory of desires and then figuring out how to maximize the satisfaction of the desires is wrong. People don't know what they want, and they have to decide what they want. You see this in all sorts of cases. You go in a restaurant and you look at the menu. You don't come, or maybe you do, but that's unusual, come with a list of preferences. You try to visualize the various things on the menu and think, well, which would be the most fun, which do you really want? So desires change, and this means that preferences change. Now, there's a deep mistake, and this, I tried to explain this to these guys in Chicago, and I have to say I don't think they really got it, and that is that they assume that action descriptions are extensional. And you know what that means. That means that laws of substitutability and so on apply. But because of the intentionality with a T of action descriptions, they're not extensional. Let me illustrate that with an example. I have a counterexample that I present to Bayesian decision theory. If it were right, then if I'm willing to bet if I value a quarter and I value my life, there must be some odds at which I would be willing to bet my life against a quarter. I value my life, I value a quarter, so there must be some odds at which I would risk my life for 25 cents. The odds would have to be horrendous, but there must be some rational odds. And the answer for me is there are no odds at which I would bet my life for 25 cents. And if there were, I wouldn't bet my child's life for 25 cents, or the future of the human race for 25 cents. Now, decision theory says there must be some odds at which you would bet your life for 25 cents. Now, whenever I presented this to famous decision theorists, they use, and I'm really talking about the best guys in the field. I argued this with Jimmy Savage in Ann Arbor and Isaac Levy at Columbia, and they always end up saying either, well, often they say, you're just plain irrational if you won't bet your life for 25 cents. Well, I think they have a problem with their theory. But another thing they say, which is more clever, is, well, you will do things that are equivalent to that. If I offer you $1,000 to drive me to San Francisco Airport, you'll take me up on that. But now divide the trip between here and San Francisco Airport into 25-cent units. Then during that 25-cent unit, when we are on the freeway passing the truck on the right, you only made 25 cents during that instant, and so you're betting your life against 25 cents because you increase the probability of your dying by driving on the freeway. Does everybody see their argument? Though you won't bet your life against 25 cents just like that, you will if we structure it in such a way that you get 25 cents for each unit on the freeway that you're passing, and at that point you're betting your life against 25 cents. That argument is so bad that I'm amazed to find that people advance it, but you know what's wrong with it, and that is the bet is always made about an action under a description. And the fact that you can take my drive and break it up into a whole bunch of tiny 25-cent units doesn't show that I'm betting on those 25-cent units. What I bet is simply the totality. And the fact that the totality consists in all these units and that you can describe each unit separately doesn't show that it's under that description that I made the bet, that I am making a bet when I drive you to San Francisco Airport. Yes, it is more dangerous to drive on the freeway than it is to stay in Berkeley, but the danger is not very much. And $1,000, I can certainly use an extra $1,000, so I'll take you up on that. But from the fact that you can break that into 25-cent units, that is driving on the freeway, it doesn't follow that my bet was divisible into 25-cent units. Another way to put it is to say, would you accept 25 cents for that portion and no money for the rest of the trip? No, I would not. It's only on the condition that there is the whole action for which I'm getting $1,000 that I will undertake the job of driving you to San Francisco Airport. Now, we should explore that more seriously because he's totally unaware of this, that under one description, you see, he thinks the fact that I do things that I know don't prolong my life to the maximum shows that I'm committing suicide. Well, committing suicide is a very special description, and that implies a certain kind of intentionality. Now, I don't know if you've ever had experiences where any of your friends committed suicide. I have. Several of my friends committed suicide, and it is a heart-wrenching experience. And for one thing, if you're ever tempted to do it, don't do it if only because of the pain that you cause all the people that you leave behind. But in every case, there was an element of irrationality in the suicide. It was a speech act. They were trying to tell us something. There was some cry of pain involved, and there was an element of irrationality. And you misappropriate things to the wrong categories if you say, well, any act that fails to increase your life to the maximum length is a form of suicide. No, it's not. That's a total distortion. Suicide is actually a very peculiar act, and generally it's irrational. Well, I won't tell you about the horrendous experiences. There was a friend of mine who eventually killed herself. She was French, Elisabeth Roche de Joubier, and she was the daughter of the head of the Sorbonne, Jean Roche. Eventually she did marry a famous British novelist, and he's written a book about her and the suicide. In the book she's called Natasha. I can't bear to read the book, but in any case, I recommend it to you because it was well reviewed. And his name is Melvyn Bragg. Melvyn Bragg's most recent novel. He's famous in England, not famous in the United States. Melvyn Bragg wrote a book about his wife's suicide. Anyway, you can see this is a case of irrational behavior on Natasha or Lisa's part. And other cases I know, it was irrational. It was not a case of, well, I got this stable preference. Over the long haul, I'd rather be dead than alive. No, it's never like that. There are cases like that. They're very unusual. I know of a case like that. A guy in Squaw Valley who owned a lot of property had terminal cancer. And all he had to look forward to, there was no question he's going to die. There's no question it's going to be a painful existence from that point until his death. So he took his favorite gun and went out in the woods and shot himself. Now that seems to me, I don't know him well enough to know the details, that seems to me rational. That seems to me, or at least it's possibly rational. But the cases I know of friends of mine who committed suicide, none of them were rational. They were all cases of irrational behavior, and they were always speech acts. They were expressing something. And you make a mistake if you suppose that all action descriptions are really the same, that the decision to commit suicide is the same as the decision to carry an umbrella. It's not. And this is another weakness of his account. There are different value scales, and he assumes everything is on the same scale. So having 25 cents and staying alive are on the same scale, and that's why it makes sense to say, would you be willing to bet your life against 25 cents? 25 cents if you win, you die if you lose. But in fact, our values are not all on the same scale. Now, the scales intersect in various ways. There's a famous story about the guy sitting next to a woman at the dinner party. He doesn't know this woman, but he says, look, would you go to bed with me for $50 million? And she thinks about, yeah, $50 million, yeah, I'd go to bed with you. And he said, okay, how about $100? And she says, wait a minute, what kind of a woman do you think I am? And he said, we've already established that. Now we're negotiating the price. Now, I think we haven't established that. I think $50 million, oddly enough, is on a different scale from $100. Why? Well, in all kinds of ways. If you had various projects that you wanted to carry out, you wanted to save the Berkeley Animal Shelter, let's say, $50 million will go a long way towards saving the Berkeley Animal Shelter. Anyway, it's not right to think that all scale, that all values, that all of our preferences are commensurable, because some preferences are really incommensurable. I can't even spell it, but anyway, it's incommensurable with others, and incommensurable with others. And this comes out in these facts that it's very hard to compare the value that I attach toward a dollar and the value that I give to my child's life. Now, that isn't to say that I wouldn't risk my child's life under any circumstances. I do it all the time. When I take my child skiing or when I drive on the freeway, yes, my child's life is more at risk than if we'd stayed home, but it's worth the risk. But it's not the same. It's not equivalent because of this point I made earlier, that he assumes falsely. I mean, unfortunately, I've been writing false things and true things in the same list, but you can figure out which is false. It's false that action descriptions are extensional. No, they are intentional with an S. You don't get substitutability. Okay, now there's some other difficulties I want to point out with his account, but let's take questions about that, because a lot of important issues in this. Yeah, you had your hand up. Yeah.
Things could look really different on the order of magnitude.
Yeah.
And so $50 million seems like it's on a different value scale.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like it's just the order of magnitude.
Well, but where human values are concerned, the order of magnitude matters. You see, if you think that all of your preferences are on the same scale, then there will be no difference between your desire for life and your desire for a beer. And I think there are important differences. I mean, Kant points this out. Kant points out there are certain things in life that have a value, but others have a dignity. You see, on Becker's account, what's wrong with prostitution? The answer is nothing. Nothing's wrong with it. It's just that's one set of preferences as opposed to another set of preferences. Absolutely nothing wrong with prostitution on Becker's account. It's just you want to get paid well if you're a prostitute because you do make certain sacrifices. But when you engage in prostitution, that is a perfectly legitimate form of rational behavior. Yeah.
I didn't see Becker, or I didn't notice anywhere in this article where Becker evaluates decisions.
Yeah, he doesn't. They're all the same.
That doesn't mean
Yeah.
he's okay with them all or that he condones them all. This isn't where, this isn't the project.
Yeah.
He's building a model, and that model isn't there to cast moral judgments or even criticize people.
Yes, what I'm saying is, where do moral judgments fit in the model? See, I want to say there's no such thing as a theory of behavior that does not account for a moral and immoral behavior, dignified and undignified behavior. Now, I think I know his answer to that, and his answer is, yes, one of your values is morality, but somebody else's values might be money. And what I'm doing is describing in a purely neutral way the laws of human behavior. And all human behavior fits the model of stable preferences, maximization, and equilibrium. Yes?
That actually does seem like the strongest defense. To
Yeah.
say, look, we're not in the business of that. But it's quite easy to just say in response, well then, if you get this result and your result is absurd,
Yeah.
then it still goes your very theory.
Yeah.
But I also think that this point about the value scales is not really a fair criticism because the cost associated, the value, even if you break everything down to the same units,
Yeah.
you're still going to attach more units to your life than you are to your coffee.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't strike me as a genuinely fair criticism.
Well, but I think it is a fair criticism because the point I made earlier, on this account, it follows that if I value 25 cents and I value my life, there must be some odds at which I would bet one against another. And I don't know any Bayesian decision theory that denies that. All these guys, I think, you must be irrational if you won't bet your life against 25 cents. And I've argued this with them. Yes, you haven't spoken. Yeah.
Scenario where knowing full well that you're kind of pitting your life against 25 cents, let's say you're at a longer
Yeah.
to dry your clothes, but know full well that if you step outside this awning, there's an astronomical chance that you would be hit by an asteroid.
Yeah, you might be struck by lightning, for example. Yeah, yeah. No, this is the argument these guys always give me, but it violates this principle that the action descriptions are extensional. It's the same action. If I step outside because I need an extra quarter from my laundromat, and I notice outside on the sidewalk there's a 25-cent piece. I mean, it's a typical philosopher's example, but anyway. And then I go out there. Now, as I'm crossing the door, I think, by stepping outside the safety of the laundromat, there's an infinitesimally small increase that this might cost my life. That truck coming down San Pablo Avenue might jump the curb and smash me down. The cloud overhead might suddenly unleash a lightning bolt where I would be safe indoors if I had not. Does that show that I really am betting my life against a quarter? I don't think so. Because you're assuming what I am challenging, namely that if the results are the same, then the action must be the same. And I don't think it is. I think you act rationally only when you act under some description rather than another. Say some more.
I agree, but
Yeah.
it seems like if you had some sort of a Aristotelian figure sitting over your shoulder who said, knowing full you're committing this act under the auspices that you are like pitting your life.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I had somebody who put it to you in those terms. Okay. Then I might think twice about going after that quarter. Yes.
I think though somebody might still do that.
Yeah. Oh, no, they might. That's right.
So
No, my conception of rationality for me, I don't want to impose it on other people. But I do want to say there's nothing irrational about my refusal to make these bets. If Becker wants to bet his life against a quarter, if I lived in Chicago, I might think differently about these things too.
do you think it would be rational for you to stay under that awning and not get the quarter with an infinitesimally small chance of being hit?
You see, in this, what is peculiar, I'll tell you what's peculiar about this case is it's not a quarter. Under the description in which I'm doing what I'm doing is not getting a quarter, but rather being able to do my laundry. Now my laundry is much more important than any quarter. Otherwise, I wouldn't be willing to spend a quarter. I'd spend $5 to get my laundry done. I do it. No. I am not, what I'm saying is you have to be careful how you describe the action. And the fact that the action is describable as enabling myself to do my laundry or getting a quarter doesn't show that those are the same action. Yes. I'll come back to you. I just want to hear.
For me, it seems like I understand where your objection is coming in, but I don't see how it comes into play because to me it's like in both cases you're going for the quarter. The only difference is in my case with the laundromat, you have the next goal of using it.
Yeah.
You get the quarter in the first case, you don't have a goal of using it on your laundry at that moment, but you might use it to buy soda next time. So it's the very fact that you can use it right immediately after getting the quarter versus saving for something else.
Yeah. No, the way that I am describing it, I mean, after all, it's a philosophical example. We can describe it any way we want. The way that I am describing it, it is essential to the description that what I'm doing is not just accumulating quarters, and my collection has gone up to 1. No, I'm now enabling myself to do something I really do need to do and do want to do, and that is complete my laundry. Next you, and then I'm going to lecture some more. Okay.
So isn't Bayesian confirmation something like there's incremental confirmation that a white truth confirms that all ravens are black, something like that. So isn't there all that they're saying is that there's an incremental chance that
Yeah.
you risk your life towards that. But it's so negligible in the same way that the confirmation of a white truth is negligible to the black.
Yeah, I don't think that's the same case. Now, I may be wrong about this, but does everybody know the paradox of confirmation? The paradox, well, there are a bunch of paradoxes, but here's one. The statement that all ravens are black is equivalent, logically, to the statement all non-black things are non-ravens, right? If one is true, the other one must be true. But that means if a black raven confirms all ravens are black, it's a piece of confirming evidence, then a white shoe is also confirming evidence that all ravens are black, because it's of a case of a non-black thing being a non-raven. Does everybody see that? And yet intuitively feel you don't get any evidence at all for that all ravens are black by going to look at the shoes in your closet. Okay, that's another problem. I'm pretty sure there's a solution to that problem. But I think that's a different question from the paradox of confirmation, are a different question from the consequences of applying a Bayesian conception of rationality. I want to list a fifth flaw that I think in this, and that is that stable preferences here are, as I said, are supposed to be desires, but I want to say this picture neglects the possibility of forming desire-independent reasons that motivate action. Now, of course, those desire-independent reasons have to be the ground of a desire, but you will fail to understand human behavior if you don't see that often I act on desires that are precisely motivated by things that are not desires, such as obligations, duties, responsibilities, etc., that I have. And the picture of human behavior as always a matter of maximizing my stable preferences seems to me cannot account for that. In general, economists can't account for this. Yes, say some more. You didn't have your hand up. Well, anybody else want to say more? I didn't mean to spend the whole damn lecture on this, but maybe it is kind of fun, and it is important because this is a very influential conception of human behavior. I think its results in questions of public policy are catastrophic. And I told you about going to visit Alan Enthoven when he was a good friend of mine, when he was Assistant Secretary of Defense, and he was a PhD in economics, and he demonstrated that the bombing of North Vietnam was the rational thing to do, because all we assumed is our enemy is rational. And if our enemy is rational, they don't even have to have had a course in economics. All they have to do is be rational. And when the bombing reaches this point, then they will realize that the disutility of being bombed is more painful than the positive utility of resisting the United States Army. And at that point, we've won. So all we have to do is increase the bombing. And that's this conception of rationality. It was the same conception of rationality that led the Japanese to Pearl Harbor. They thought that these Americans are rational if we can sink their entire Pacific fleet. Sink the entire Pacific fleet, then it would take years and years for them to be able to overcome our military hegemony in the Western Pacific. And at that time, we will simply establish and consolidate our power, and they will recognize the irrationality of any further resistance. Now, that is not how it turned out. The way it turned out was what's the fourth? The fourth, I can't remember the fourth. It was Kaga, Ikago, Siryu, and I can't remember the name of the fourth. There were 4 Japanese aircraft carriers sunk in June of 1942 off Midway Island, and it changed world history. We're all here as a result of that, because up to that point, nothing had stopped the Japanese. And a group of American bomber pilots, not much, well, no older than yourselves, most of them died, sank essentially the heart of the Japanese Navy, and in 15 minutes changed world history. And I'm ashamed to say I can't remember the names of all 4 carriers. I'll report back on Thursday, or you can do your homework yourself. Siryu, Kaga, Ikago, Siryu, and there was one other one. God, this is scandalous. Nobody here knows why we're here. We're here, well, this is why we're here. All right, we'll go on with this. Now, I'm going to turn to another topic before, my gosh, I didn't leave myself much time. All right, well, there are a whole bunch of other authors we ought to be talking about. We ought to talk about Chuck Taylor. So let's talk about a famous article which has got a title that you've been assigned, and it is about essentially the role of hermeneutics in the interpretation of human behavior. And here he says that if we contrast, remember I told you that in the explanation of social behavior, there are two broad streams. There's the naturalist stream, exemplified by Hempel, that says the explanation of human behavior is like anything else. What we're looking for are scientific laws. And in a way, I think that is the model that drives Becker, because we're not to think of these as some sort of normative. This is just a description of how it is. These are just the actual forces that drive behavior: stable preferences, maximization, and market equilibrium. And then on the other side are the people who, like Taylor, Habermas, and then all the H's, Hegel and Husserl, who think we have to have a sort of hermeneutical approach, that interpretation is crucial to understanding human behavior. I think that the issue is largely misconceived, but if I had to choose, it seems to me, so to speak, the bad guys are on the right side in this one. That is, the people who come across as more or less obscurantists, the people who support hermeneutic and the Bevorkenheit and the Befindlichkeit of Dasein and the Lebenswelt and all that, they have more truth on their side than Hempel and my good friends. And basically what they recognize is the importance of intentional causation. Now, they don't recognize it explicitly, but that's the picture of human behavior that I'm giving you, is that where human behavior is concerned, you have to always ask yourself, what motivates these people? The driving force, as always, is causation, but in the case of human behavior, it's intentional causation, and that means that the term that functions in the explanation has to function causally in the behavior that is being explained. In other words, you cannot explain Napoleon's invasion of Russia by appealing to the marginal propensity to consume, because Napoleon didn't have that concept. You have to say things like, well, he felt that the revolution in France would never be complete as long as as long as an oppressive government existed in Moscow, and he felt he had to overthrow it. Or if you ask, well, why did Hitler invade Russia? Well, we know the answer to that. He wanted Lebensraum in the East. He thought that Germany, in order to expand, needed far greater territories than were available in Central Europe, and he had to expand to the East. But those are cases where the appeals to the desire have to use concepts that are present in the mind of the agent whose behavior is being explained, and those concepts function causally. And consequently, it's quite unlike the natural sciences, because the concepts, the falling body doesn't have to have any concepts. There's no intentional causation involved. But where intentional causation is concerned, the concepts that function in the explanation have to be the very same concepts that were present in the mind of the agent whose behavior is being explained, and that function causally in his or her behavior. Okay, so Taylor dimly sees that, and he says, well, when we do these hermeneutical explanations, you have to remember that there always has to be some object to which the meaning is attached. It's like linguistics here. And the object that has the meaning must be part of a field of meaning. So any word gets its meaning only in a field of other meanings, only in a field of meanings. And similarly with social behavior, an act such as voting gets its meaning only in a field of meanings that include elections, majorities, majority rule, and all of the other apparatus that go with voting. So you have an object, you have a field of meaning, and then there must be a subject for whom this is meaningful. There must be some person or set of persons who treat the object as meaningful in that field. And then our aim is to get an understanding, a hermeneutical understanding. And what is that? Well, he says, it makes clear what was otherwise unclear or confused. Now, I think that's wrong on his part, because it needn't have been confused beforehand. I mean, you can describe the present election in the United States without assuming that there's some mystery or confusion. No, it's perfectly clear what's going on. So I think he's wrong to suppose that the aim of the hermeneutical explanation is to make clear what was otherwise confused, because it need not have been confused. But he does say, I think correctly, that when we are explaining other people's behavior, we have to appeal to notions like sense or coherence. We have to be able to say that their behavior is coherent in certain ways, and we have to make sense of their behavior, and that's not always easy to do. It's very puzzling why Hitler would have invaded Russia at a time when he still had a war on the Western Front. He had not succeeded in defeating the British. Now, Stalin's remarks afterwards are very revealing. He said, I was totally mistaken about Hitler because I assumed he would do what I would do. He would think the way I would think. And so I didn't expect him to attack Russia, attack the Soviet Union, as it was then called. I didn't assume that he would attack Russia until he had defeated England, that he would not. The nightmare of German military policy has always been a war on two fronts, and that's exactly what Hitler brought about in June of 1941 when he invaded Russia. However, it did have this advantage from the German point of view. The Russians were taken totally by surprise. And indeed, in the early days of that conflict, orders went out from Moscow not to fight back because there must be some mistake. There must have been some misunderstanding because the Germans, we have a non-aggression pact with them, and they can't be attacking us. And Stalin himself thought, well, they think the way I do, and I wouldn't attack. Well, I already had a war going on. Hitler, I think, had a different method of reasoning, and his reasoning was a bit like Robespierre. Audacity had always worked. He was always doing the most audacious thing, and it always worked. In 1938, when they threatened to invade Czechoslovakia, his general said, we're not ready for war, you can't do this. And the British and the French simply backed down. They simply gave in at Munich, and they signed these agreements that essentially dismembered Czechoslovakia. So Hitler went against the advice of his generals. He did the most audacious thing, and he'd been doing that all along. He did it when he became chancellor. He did it in the time of the Munich Putsch in the 1920s, and he continued to do it, right through 1941 when he told his guys, you got to stand firm, you can't retreat. And it worked. It worked in the winter of 1941. They stood firm. It failed. It started to fail at Stalingrad. And in fact, at Stalingrad, that game was over. The Germans lost 300,000 men, and that wasn't a loss they could make good. But if I had to explain Hitler's behavior, which appears irrational on the face of it, it seems rational to him because it had always worked. He did the thing that everybody else said was a crazy thing to do, and he always succeeded. He became chancellor. He conquered France. He got the British and the French to give in at Munich, and he almost succeeded in Russia. He rolled up a great deal of Russia. How much time have we got? Are we running out of time? Oh, 2 minutes. Oh, well, we can cover a whole lot in 2 minutes. I was going to explain structuralism in 2 minutes. Okay, here we go. Some nonsense sounds better in French. Le structuralisme. It sounds better in French. Anyway, structuralism is based on a misunderstanding of Saussure. And Saussure was a very famous Swiss linguist who gave a series of lectures called Cours de linguistique générale, the course in general linguistics. And as far as I know, Saussure never actually published it himself. His students made lecture notes, and then they published it. You guys can check that. I'm pretty sure that's right, though. And what Saussure invented was the structuralist method in linguistics, and then this method was applied quite generally to all kinds of things. Was applied to the development of intellectual life. And indeed, Foucault wrote a famous book called The Order of Things. It was called Les mots et les choses in French, but it was translated as The Order of Things because there already was a book called Words and Things, and he didn't want to have the same title. And he denied, Foucault always denied that he was a structuralist. He got offended, but I think, in fact, Les mots et les choses is best understood as a type of structuralism, and I will explain that to you on Thursday.